Hello, Rasa community. I am here today. This is Rachael, by the way, with Emily Bender, who I actually know quite well because I went to the University of Washington for my PhD program, and Emily was in the department where I got my degree, although not on my committee, because I was. Well, actually, do you want to talk a little bit about your work and your specialization in NLP?
Sure. So I think at the time that you were at UW, I was probably primarily working on grammar engineering. So looking at syntax and semantics cross-linguistically, applications of that to endangered language documentation, and moving into computational semantics. So how do we build semantic representations that can be built up compositionally with grammars? And I think as you were finishing, I was just starting to move into the space of looking at the societal impacts of NLP. And that's where we really connected. I remember being really excited about your work, but it would make sense I wasn't on your committee.
Yes. Yeah, I focused more on speech and sociolinguistics and language learning, and not really processing, but more on the learning side of things, human learning.
We got boiler.
Yeah, so that's what you were doing in 2017 when I graduated. Time continues to move forward. And I think you're probably best known, well, I would say for two things in the NLP community. And the first is the Bender rule, which folks who watch the YouTube channel, the Rasa YouTube channel, know that I just get upset when people only talk about English, because most people don't speak English. It's a cool language. It's my native language. It has some interesting features, but it's not everybody's, right? So what is the Bender rule, and how does it relate to me getting upset about English only?
So the Bender rule, I didn't name it, but once people named it, I ran with it. And the Bender rule states that you should always name the language you're working on, even when it's just English. Mm-hmm. And what this comes from is so much work in NLP where people talk about, we create a solution for question answering, or we're working on, biomedical information extraction, or whatever the specific topic is, and they don't say in English. And the problem here is that when you have a situation where work on English gets presented as completely general, but work on other languages is language specific, then it becomes really hard to publish the work on other languages, and you have this weird disadvantage, completely, irrational disadvantage to work that happens to be in other languages that then says it's on the other language, and people go, oh, but your solution's not general. Well, your solution for English isn't general either.
Yeah. English, I mentioned it has lots of interesting features. Probably the one that makes work on English the least extensible, well, grammatically, is that we have a very impoverished morphology. There's not a lot of sort of like word bits that contribute meaning, or grammatical meaning, I should say. So a language like German has, very long words that have lots of bits. Inuktitut, very long words that have lots of bits. Tagalog, many languages have this feature, and English does not. So a lot of English NLP pipelines just don't handle that very much, if at all.
Exactly. We can do lemmatization by just hacking off the last few characters of a word and call it good in English, and like that. So it doesn't scale to languages that are doing much more interesting things in the morphology. And just, this idea that, so I've actually been on this soapbox since about 2009. There was a workshop at EACL in Athens called something about the relationship between linguistics and computational linguistics. And then there was these 3 V words. It was like virtuous, vicious, or vicarious, I think, were the V's. And my talk was basically, you can't claim that something is language independent unless you test that. Yeah. And that was, at the time, I felt like there's a whole bunch of NLP stuff that said, look, no linguistics. Basically, if you didn't put in any linguistic knowledge, then therefore it must be completely general across languages, when in fact everything was being developed against this one particular language that, it's a perfectly fine language, as you say. It's also my first language, but it's not representative of all languages. And so I've been sort of going on about that for a while. And then it was in 2019 is where it really exploded, because I basically said, okay, I'm going to ask this question at NACL, the North American chapter of the ACL. For every talk that doesn't mention the language, I'm just going to say, and what language was this on? And and I would go to a session with 6 papers, and by the second or third one, people would catch on to what I was doing. And that was where it took off. And the best one of those actually was at the best paper session at the end. So this was, imagine you've got the hotel ballroom, because this was in the before times where conferences worked like that. And there's 1,000+ people all sitting in chairs in the ballroom with the sort of temporary walls opened up. And someone gave the last paper of the best paper session, or at least the last one that I could stick around for, because I was heading to the airport. And it was something, it won best paper for a reason. Like, it was some tweak to the neural architecture that was getting impressive improvements on XYZ tasks. And they didn't mention the language. So the presenter went over time, and the session chair said, okay, we have time for one quick question. And I was already standing up towards the back of the room because I needed to leave to go to the airport. So I just walked up to the mic and I said, Emily Bender, University of Washington, what language was this on? And the presenter said, English. But they hadn't been part of the conversation before, so they didn't know where I was coming from. But the entire room laughed, and I left for the airport. So that's, if people want to read more, I wrote up a sort of a history of the Bender rule and some discussion of the ways in which English is not representative, and that you can find in the gradient. And there's a link from my publications page. Yeah,
your website's always very helpful as a way to pull together information. Yeah, and I think it's very much like a research specific problem almost, because as someone who's a little bit more, at the coalface and working with developers who need to get the shit by the end of Q1, obviously they know what language they're working on, and it's very important that the tool works for their language. And it's interesting, and I think it's become more of a problem almost, in that these sort of the hot, exciting research topics are really focused on English, and it's not necessarily at this point, I'm talking about language models here. I'm talking about really big language models. And the thing about really big language models is they may not need as much sort of grammatical machinery, I guess, is one way to put it, as much formal grammar representation. Or they may, I don't know, that's not my research area. But they do rely on having truly, truly, truly enormous corpora. And last week we were talking about someone who was building an assistant and had written a paper about it in Vietnamese. And they used fast text, the Vietnamese language fast text embeddings, and they used multilingual BERT, and they tried the Vietnamese version, and the Vietnamese version of BERT just did not work for their data set, and the fast text embeddings were much better. And just also the embeddings that they pre-trained just with their training data were also much better than this really big model. And I think a big part of that is how much computerized data do you have for a specific language, and that is not evenly distributed.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think that, you say that this is more of a research problem than a, practical applications problem, because people who are building something obviously know what language they're building for. But to the extent that the research developments inform what's happening in industry, when everybody's working primarily on English, and furthermore, on English with methodologies that you say just don't scale across languages, because you can't get a terabyte of data, even in Vietnamese, right? And, Vietnamese is not anywhere near the bottom of the list in terms of language resources. Right?
Yeah, and it's the biggest language in its family as well. It's not like you can sort of scooch in some German or some French language resources.
Right. And pull stuff over. So when the research community is all focused on these things that aren't going to scale to, other languages, and you don't have to go to languages with really small speaker communities, which are also very important, and it's sort of especially important when you're talking about the value of maintaining a language and reclaiming a language to community cohesiveness and stuff like that. So, but you don't even have to go there to see this problem. You look at languages that have millions of speakers, but they aren't the ones that have lots of resources. And they might have, millions of speakers who are doing a lot of social media and texting and stuff like that. But you don't have well-developed news corpora. You don't have something like the Common Crawl in that language. And you also might not have the same degree of standardization of the writing system. Which is so one of the ways in which English is weird is that we've actually had a pretty standardized writing system for a good long time. And that is quite convenient for natural language technology and quite unrepresentative. So yeah, I think that these, there's certainly scientific interest in the large language models, but they, one of the downsides to them is they sort of suck attention away from techniques that are going to be more scalable across languages.
And I'm gonna do the thing that good interviewers do and say something I kind of don't agree with, but I think that a lot of people would sort of like jump in here and be like, okay, yeah, but aren't these really big language models not really models of language, but models of the world? Because they're trained on all of this different text, right? And so they've extracted a deep understanding of what it means to be a dog, for example. And this is like I not something that I agree with, but definitely a point that I have seen made quite a bit.
Yeah. So what does it mean to say that a large language model is a model of the world? So there's a couple different directions that I want to go with on that. And I think maybe the first thing that I want to say is to relay another conference experience. So at ACL 2016 in Berlin, there was a workshop, the first workshop on representation learning for NLP. And this was all about, word embeddings and stuff like that, and sort of understanding what they're doing and how do we test them and things like that. And I'm sort of following along and kind of making a pest of myself on Twitter going, representation of what? Right? What are these word representations representing? And the answer was, well, the words. Well, what about the words, right? Because as a linguist, I come at this with this notion that language is a system of signs. And this goes back to dissocier, right? You have pairings of form and meaning. I should say dissocier is probably only one of the sources of that. Panini probably has something similar and so on. But when linguists look at language, we see, okay, there's symbolic systems, and a symbol is a pairing of a sign and a signified. And when you're doing word embeddings, when the training data is just the form, then all you can represent is distributional facts about the words. And that's not what people are talking about when they talk about word representations. And it's true that those distributional facts are sensitive to things that look like lexical semantics as well as things that look like syntax. So, there's the so-called, word analogy problems. Although, that's a little bit of a parlor trick. Mm-hmm. So, Natalie Schluter has a nice paper in, I think, ACL 2018 or NACL 2018, sort of saying there's a problem with using this as a test. And one of the problems is that, if you do what's the famous thing? So,
king minus man plus woman equals queen, I think.
Yeah, exactly. That's the one that I was thinking of. And then, of course, there was the Bologlassi et al. One, which is like, man is to computer programmer as woman is to, and it gets completed as homemaker, which is awful. And it points up an important problem that I'm going to get to in the second half of this rant. But Natalie Schluter's point is that, actually, though, when you run that test, one of the requirements is you can't return if it's A is to B is C is to blank, you can't return B again. That was actually part of the setup. And so if the answer was going to be computer programmer, it couldn't come out. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit broken as a test, which is not to say that these things aren't picking up various kinds of biases. And that's the other really important point. So when we say the language model has modeled the world, well, it has modeled word distributions. And if you poke at it in the right way, you can get things out that look like facts about the world. And I don't have the authors of this one, but there's a recent paper actually out of Google showing that you can poke at these very large language models in a particularly clever way and get it to spit out memorized bits of its training data, including personally identifiable information.
Oh yeah, the one that with phone numbers and emails. Yeah, no, I saw that as well.
Exactly. So certainly the language models encode the text they've been trained on, and they can spit it out in various ways, and they can give you things that are coherent seeming, and then we as humans go to that and add the meaning. But even that, even if we say, okay, it's not a representation of the world, it's a representation of language about the world. And you have to have a human coming in there to get from the language to understanding. There's still the problem that, well, what is that training data, right? When people talk about the world, it is not a dispassionate, sort of appropriately distributed set of statements of true facts, but it is things that people chose to say based on their own viewpoints and opinions. And that's what the language models are picking up. And that's where you get all of the initial investigation into it was looking first at gender bias in language models for English, but it goes on and on and on, and we've seen lots of it. And so it's really worth thinking about, okay, if I'm going to deploy this as part of my technology in any way, what do I need to worry about in terms of, given that it's not really the world that's represented, it's things that people have said about the world. And I know that there's a lot of garbage out there, and the bigger the data collection, the more the garbage. How do we figure out how to use these safely and appropriately? That's my answer to that. But
yeah, I think there's two parts to that I think about a lot, and one of them is that if you have a large corpus that you have scraped, that you haven't hand validated, it almost certainly has hate speech in it, and it may have speech in it that you don't recognize as hate speech, but that is still, encoding, a space representation. It's moving things closer together that don't necessarily need to be very close together, and that's going to have effects downstream. So that's one thing. And then the other is something that Reg Schwartz has, she just put out her blog post of her workshop on common sense. And one thing that she points out that I think I've heard about is the black swan problem as well, is that the things that we say about the world are not, like, if I think about all the objects in my house, right? I don't have a house. If I think about all the objects in my apartment, I don't talk about each of those objects in equal amount, right? There are certain objects that I'm going to talk about more, and some of the most important objects I may never talk about, even though I interact with them quite a bit. So, for example, I am very likely to talk about a new object in my environment, even if it's not an important object, right? Like if I bring in a piece of junk mail and I'm like, oh, hey, check out this junk mail. Do you want it? My husband's like, no, I don't want it. And then I throw it away. We've talked about this very transient object that is not important to us. But if you looked at sort of all of the things that we said in a day, you'd be like, oh, that junk mail, they're talking about it a lot. That must be more important than like, the coffee that I've drunk over the course of a day, because maybe I don't talk about the coffee, but it's very important to me personally. So there's both like the problem of, you are going to be picking up and potentially amplifying things that I think most people would agree are bad, but also it's not going to be a good representation of the world just because it's been filtered around between, one human and then what one human is going to write down and communicate to another human. And we get all sorts of sensory information that we just, we don't record. That's not important.
Yeah. So one of the things I think is really helpful in thinking about how to have computers helpfully communicating with people or using human language in a way that is a bit like human communication is to think about what it is that we're doing when we're communicating with language. And it is absolutely not the case that we are taking every single relevant bit of information and then encoding it all very precisely in a series of words. And then our interlocutor unpacks those words and gets back exactly that communication, right? There's people who look into this. So Herb Clark has a wonderful book called Using Language, which is a really fun read. There's a very strange and wonderful paper by Reddy, whose first name I don't remember, from 1979, talking about the toolmaker's paradigm. And also the conduit metaphor. So Reddy's basically saying in English, when we talk about language, we have this extended metaphor of language as a conduit, where it's hard for me to get my ideas across, or with basically all the stuff that says the meaning is in the text, and it's not, right? That basically when we communicate, we are doing our best to guess at the communicative intent of the other person based on a whole bunch of common ground. Sometimes, like you and I have a lot of actual like shared experiences at UW that increases our common ground. But as humans, we can make, assumptions about common ground like, oh, water is wet. And if you drop a leaf, it will fall more slowly than if you drop a rock. And, even if we don't know the physics behind that, we have that shared experience. And so we would never say it out loud unless you're a linguist doing what I'm doing right now. And then in the communicative moment, you basically pick a series of words with its associated syntactic structure, with its associated conventional meaning, that is therefore a very rich cue to your interlocutor to figure out what it was that you wanted to convey. And that's, so what that means is you don't bother saying things that are obvious. And so if a computer is trying to learn common sense from what people say, it's going to get a very strange picture of the world.
There's a dumb example of this. There's a Vine rip. Vine was a platform for very short videos,
Yes.
where someone says, "Toss me my keys," and somebody throws them an office printer. So it's about 2 feet by 2 feet, and of course it crashes onto the ground and smashes into 1,000 pieces. And the person to whom it was tossed says, "I said my keys," and the other person is like, "Oh, I thought you said printer." And then the person to whom it was tossed says, "Why would I say printer?" So I think that knowledge that you don't toss people printers, right, is why this person who was tossed at has that sense of anger and frustration, and that's what makes it a funny joke. I find it funny.
That's hilarious. But then linguist humor. So do you remember there was the Star Trek reboot, and they've got the comms guy who's got a heavy Russian accent, and he's on the Enterprise for the first time.
Chekhov, right?
Yes, Chekhov. And in the Star Trek reboot, he can't get the computer to understand him. And I saw this in a movie theater again well before times. And that scene hit, and I was just laughing, and nobody else in the theater thought anything funny had just happened. So exactly. Your point with the same with the printer is, not only is that a completely implausible mishearing, right? What is the word for printer that sounds like keys? We don't have one. And in fact, you almost expect that to be what the joke is going to be. And then the joke is, but that would be a ridiculous thing to say. And so, how would a computer know that? Right. And a computer might know that because it's a low frequency thing to say. But then, as you're pointing out, there's also things that we don't say that are perfectly sensible. It's just they don't need saying because they're so sensible.
And also there's, something that I think is pretty common, particularly in language generation, is that you try to target saying things that are a little bit less low frequency, so you don't get that that thing where you get stuck in repetition, or that you're just repeating things that you saw in the training data. So very much a temperature dial that someone might tweak.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's things that are left unsaid that are part of the biases that we don't want to pick up. So, Robin Spears' example about Yelp reviews at Mexican restaurants? This is...
I remember reading about it, but I remember zero details.
All right. So 2017-ish, and it's published as a blog post. And I sort of said, should publish this as a paper. She's like, "Oh, who would take it?" I'm like, this is excellent. But what she did was she took some off-the-shelf word embeddings, circa 2017, and used them as a component in a sentiment analysis system. Yeah. And found, so, you got Yelp reviews, you got the text of the restaurant review, and the task is to predict the stars. So she builds this system and finds that the resulting system is under predicting the stars for Mexican restaurants in particular. Like, well, what's this about? And it turns out, going back to the source data for those word embeddings, included a bunch of general web garbage in English, which includes all of our terrible discourse about immigration, from and through Mexico. And because of all the terrible things that people say, not just on sort of hate speech concentrated websites, but, our politicians in the media, right? You can't say, okay, well, clearly this won't happen if I restrict my attention to respectable publications like the New York Times, because they're also going to be, publishing this stuff as quotes at least. And so it came to this point that basically what you're talking before about how words end up in space closer to other words where they shouldn't. And the word Mexican in that discourse is too close in space to things like illegal and crime and stuff like that. Not because of anything actually about, it's kind of something about the world. Yeah, not about the underlying population, but it's about the world in the sense it's about the bias that's in the world. It's about the people who are saying those things. And sort of the net result is the sentiment analysis system picked up that this word Mexican was a negative sentiment word. And so therefore, if you called a restaurant a Mexican restaurant, you clearly were not going to give it a good review, which was wrong. So I think it was a really nice demonstration of how you don't have to even directly say something like, if these people aren't on record saying, "I hate Mexican people." It's a little bit more subtle than that. It's about where the words show up together, and it can have these consequences. And if you don't know what's in the training data, then how do you know what kinds of things your system's going to have picked up? And as you were saying before, nobody has the ability to understand everything that's hate speech, or even not hate speech, but just like denigration, right? Because we aren't sensitive to stuff that is outside of our experience. And so you can't, like, even if you were to go through and read every piece of text, you couldn't be sure not to have, I've got too many negatives in there. You couldn't be sure to have caught everything. So I was slightly distracted by Euler, who's checking out the computer. There she is.
Yeah. And I know, on the one hand, I think it's very good to be aware of the potential problems, but on the other hand, I mean, certainly for building a commercial system, like, especially for, a language where you have maybe some web corpora, but maybe not a resource like something like WordNet, which I think, so WordNet is a structured knowledge representation of things, although I think people are using ConceptNet more these days. Anyway, not my research area. And I think there's some idea that these things should be universal to some degree, but I think that is probably not the case for a number of reasons. But anyway, so if you're working in a language that doesn't have these, large structured corpora, and you don't have time or money to build them, especially given how difficult it is to get data sets projects funded in general, then, vector semantics and representational semantics and, language modeling can really help you get a warm start. And I think the question for me as a practitioner is like, okay, it's not going away, right? We're not going to stop using language models. We're not going to stop using, language models, I should say, also did not suddenly appear in 2017. They've been part of the NLP landscape pretty much since its inception. The methods have changed. So there's these tools. We know that they have the potential to A, cause harm, and B, just like not do what we want them to do in terms of, creating successful products that are useful for people and make their lives better, which, that's why I got into NLP, because I wanted to help build things that really genuinely helped people. So what do we do, right? Do we all hand build grammars for everything all the time? I think that's probably not a very sustainable solution.
No, I certainly, there's a time and a place for hand building grammars, and it's still a research area for me, but it is not a general purpose solution to all tasks. But I think that the people who are working on developing a particular solution for a particular use case have a superpower, which is that they've got a concrete use case in front of them. And so I think that one of the ways in which linguistic knowledge can really inform NLP is in doing error analysis and evaluation. And so thinking about, okay, what are the cases I expect this to work in? Let me build out my test suite to make sure that it works in those cases. And then what are the failure modes? So when it doesn't work, how does it behave, right? Does it pretend as if it's still working and kind of go off the rails? Does it have a way to say, I didn't understand? Is there a way to signal the uncertainty to the user? I think that for, conversational agents in particular, it's really important that the user know that they're speaking with an artificial agent.
Absolutely.
And then setting expectations appropriately. So what can you expect this artificial agent to do? And then what are its range of outputs, and like spending some time with the sort of, dystopian Black Mirror ideas of like, okay, what's the worst possible thing that given this set of responses that I'm prepared to give, what's the worst possible question that they could be answering in terms of it looking like a bad combination? Sort of exploring that space and figuring out how to put some fail safes around it, I think makes a lot of sense. And this stuff is really hard to do at the very general level, right? If we're talking about, what can go wrong with a language model, it's okay, well, what's the use case? Where is it being used? And we can spend some time talking about, imagining particular use cases, but you're never going to be able to be thorough about that. And you can't be 100% even in one particular use case, but you can get a lot further. And I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that sort of, especially at the design stage, like really anticipating where things are going to have the potential to go off the rails, have the potential to be harmful. And our, some of the things that we've done at Rasa to help with this. By the way, if you've ever initialized a Rasa bot, we have a set of bot principles in the repo you fork that talks about sort of our suggestions, and not deceiving people is a really big one. So our sort of approach to it has been that you, as some person who is designing or working with the designers and figuring out what your system can do, because we really do task-driven dialogue agents. We don't do, I mean, you could use Rasa to build an open-ended chit-chat bot, but that's not really our core use case. Because we're building a platform for everybody, but we do need to sell it to people who are building products, and those products do have to work. And usually those are like, customer support agents or FAQ bots or helping people solve problems and do things. So a couple of things that we've really provided, because we do use transformers, we do use language models, we do use pre-trained feature representations of various words. Rules. So having a way to have a rule in your system. And my go-to example is if you have like a fun bartender bot that's helping to sell alcohol, you would want to make sure that the person that you're talking to is in the United States over 21. Otherwise, you end the conversation, right? It always needs to happen that way. You cannot sell alcohol to minors or market. Excuse me.
Gesundheit. Welcome spring.
Right? I know, I am excited for it. And then the other thing that we're doing instead of rules is really, like, I personally wouldn't recommend generating language output. And I know that there have been situations where people have done that. A couple of ones that have gone really off the rails. Tay, which is a chatbot put out by Microsoft, where it was very much end-to-end. People interacted with the assistant like added those turns to the training data and retrained, and ended up saying like really horrible racist stuff pretty quickly. And actually
within 24 hours. Yeah, they took it down within 24 hours.
And then Luda, I think, is the one that happened like a couple weeks ago in January. Was out of a South Korean firm who was doing basically the same thing. So I would just never recommend that. And instead using yieldy template systems. Go ahead.
Yes, but even when you've got canned responses, there's an open-endedness, which has to do with the fact that humans interpret language in context. And so one of the same statement can end up meaning very different things depending on what the question was that was asked. And I have a couple of examples that come from the Google search snippets. So one was almost a year ago, early in the pandemic. An older person who I care about was needing to decide if they needed to go into the hospital or not. And I was like, oh, and they like woke me up to ask this question. So I was, not operating on all cylinders, but it's like, okay, there's advice nurses. So let me search up 24-hour advice nurse. And what comes up basically displayed a phone number saying, you can call an advice nurse at this number 24 hours a day. And the text above that had something about the University of Washington, which I recognize as, a hospital in our area. And also the word or the acronym UMP, which stands for Uniform Medical Plan, which is the health insurance that employees in the University of Washington are a part of. Anyway, in my sleepy state, and I consider myself a very information savvy person, but I was not able to put together the fact that there was a name of a health insurance plan there with the information that, the way our health system works in the US, you don't just have open access to things, and something like an advice nurse is going to be health plan specific. So that answer was very much unhelpful in the moment because the question that I was coming in with contextualized it in a way that wasn't helpful. So that's one example. And then the other example was just a couple of weeks ago, someone discovered that if on Google you search, when did people come to America?
Oh,
did you see this one?
Yeah, I saw that.
It gave this snippet response box from this actually Library of Congress American History site, which itself is quite problematic because it starts American history in 1492. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. But basically, it answers that question with something about the Jamestown settlers. And it's like, that's when people came to America. But if you, in that same moment, ask, when did humans come to America? You get this answer about, 33,000 years ago. Nowhere do you get the answer of the indigenous peoples of this continent have been here since time immemorial, which is, another take on that question. But it's, the snippet people, no, I think the Jamestown snippet didn't say that people first came to America. It was talking about some specific people who came at that time for specific reasons. But because it was in the context of this question, when did people first come to America? That question answer pair becomes incredibly problematic. And so I would encourage people, even when they're working with, good old templates, which I think are a good, safe way to go, to spend some time thinking about, okay, given this template, what kind of question could make this answer look really, really cringy bad? Like, what's the, and then figure out how to design for, either somebody coming in, not really knowing what the capabilities of the chatbot are and asking a question that might give that kind of response, or somebody coming in trying to make your company look bad by giving that question answer pair. So even templates aren't safe is the take home message here, because language is interpreted in context.
And I think so the things I've talked about so far that we really think about a lot are more on the sort of the design side. But once something goes out to users, our philosophy that we recommend you adopt is to, as people use your assistant, look at the conversations. I mean, obviously inform them that you're going to be doing this and that they've accepted the privacy policy, but look at the conversations, annotate what's gone wrong, because usually in a conversational setting, you can tell within a couple turns, how someone's doing, how they're enjoying their experience, and fixing mistakes, and then retraining and redeploying so that your model is continuously being exposed to and correcting for places where it is not meeting users' needs. And obviously, perhaps this isn't obvious, I recommend starting with people in your team, just really, trying conversations, saying things that are a little bit off the wall. Oftentimes, just like in Rasa, we'll send each other links and be like, hey, say some dumb stuff to my chatbot, please. I want to make sure it can handle it well, and we can get to the point where it's ready to go out to some folks.
Yeah,
but you can't. And this is, I know that this feels like the promise of the future, but if you're working with language data, you do have to look at it. You're never going to be able to get out of looking at and annotating language data.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And this comes back to that look, ma, no linguistics thing. Like, I think a lot of the, where the value is placed in machine learning is getting the machine to do the learning so the person doesn't have to. And this is, me as a linguist in NLP, my sort of constant position has been, you can't tell if it's working if you don't understand the task that you're asking it to do. Yeah. And so, yes, there's value in getting a machine that can be trained, because there are cases where you want something that's continually updated, or, is dealing with larger data sets than a person can do by hand. But that doesn't mean that the person doesn't look at any data. And if you've got something that's continually updating, then you definitely need to be continually testing it, or you're quickly in Thailand.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's, I don't know, particularly when you're working on commercial products, I think it pays to be a little bit conservative in, what you serve to users, and really think about it. And I don't know, I'm sappy. I think that, engineers are the safeguards of users, and that, our job is really to help make people's lives better, and we should prioritize that in our work.
Yeah, again, exactly. I mean, just like we appreciate civil engineers who, design building codes and make sure the bridges don't fall down and stuff like that. It's that engineering ethos of building structures that are safe and have fail-safes are, that I think applies just as much in language engineering.
I don't know. My sort of personal stance on stuff is that I don't like the ethos of moving fast and breaking things, because usually it is not the people who are breaking whose things are being broken. And it just don't sit right with me.
Yeah. Exactly. And we talk about disrupting things. Like, well, what are you disrupting, and to whose advantage? Right? So are you disrupting systems of oppression? Then keep going. But also, anytime you're disrupting a system, what are you putting in its place? Right? Are you putting a power vacuum that is going to be a free-for-all? Or are you putting in something that is sort of constructively put together around justice and care? Then great, right? And I think, as we look to civil engineering as a metaphor, right? You think about civil engineers, and now I'm way outside my area of expertise, but they know things about materials and how they work, and the kinds of dangers and things the materials are going to be exposed to, right? So you've got the, extreme temperatures, you've got earthquakes, you've got wind, right? So what's the, what are the conditions that we're designing for? And I think similarly, when you're talking about language technology, you need to know something about, the machine learning models or the, rule-based models that you've built, but you also need to know something about the language that it's working with. And then about the way people behave. Like what are the conditions under which this thing has to be robust and successful and, safe. And safe there is safe for the users who are coming up to experience it, and also safe for the reputation of the company that it's representing. Right?
Yeah, it's I don't know. I feel like no one wins when bad products happen. And it's just, it doesn't feel great to work on them. It doesn't feel great to use them.
Yeah. And one of the interesting spaces in here is thinking about accountability for speech acts. So if I say something, right, I have accountability for what I've said. And if I've said something that insults somebody, then I have a responsibility to, apologize and try to make things right and take responsibility for what I said. When a chatbot, so that's me speaking as an individual, right? If I'm speaking as a representative of an organization, then the organization has some accountability for what I'm saying, and I have accountability to the organization. And so when you're talking about an artificial agent and the people designing the artificial agent and the organization that sponsors the artificial agent, there's interesting questions about accountability and how we understand sort of who's doing the speaking and on whose behalf and what that means about how we interpret the words.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to say, I'm not a lawyer, talk to a lawyer, but in the United States, like we have, pretty liberal laws about what you can say about folks. In places like England, I know libel laws are much stricter. So if your assistant that's just generating languages does a libel, whose fault is that? And I think there was a case out of a court, I want to say in Indonesia recently, that was like, it's the engineers. Which obviously not going to apply to every legal system, but yeah, I think that's a question that will be answered pretty soon.
Yeah. I know, and I would like to see it answered maybe in terms of like if you've got a thing, an artificial agent deployed on behalf of a company, then I think the company has some responsibility for testing it, and like I think that it's probably the corporate entity, and then the corporate entity is going to say, okay, well, we've hired engineers to work on this. And so it is their responsibility of their job to do this testing and sort of build those things in. And that's not weird, right? Like if you talk about, consumer safety with products, right? If someone, a pharmaceutical company is making pills and their expiration date is way off, right? And they are actually ineffective by the time the person's taking them, even though the date says there's a year left or whatever. There's accountability and responsibility there. And, again, same thing. If we're making products, even if people are using them for free, there's still got to be some accountability for them.
Yeah. And I guess on the flip side of that, I don't know, I always like to talk about why I think conversational AI is good, because I get a lot of questions. A lot of people ask me the question that is some variant on why do you work on chatbots? They're bad, or I don't like using them. And I think that it really comes back to sort of why I'm a linguist, and that I think language is great, and I think it's a great way to give and get information, and it's a way that almost all humans already have access to in some capacity or another. So being able to build systems that you don't have to learn how to use a mouse to use, that you don't have to learn how to navigate a web browser to use. I actually don't know if you know this. In graduate school, I was an adult literacy tutor with literacy stores. They used to be in Fremont. They're up in Lakewood now. Anyway, and one of the classes they taught was like basic computer skills. And what they found was that when they switched from using desktop computers to tablets, students had a lot more success because it's much more intuitive and it takes a lot less learning to use your finger on a screen than it does a mouse on a computer, right? That's a learned skill. And I think especially if you're quote unquote digital native or certainly working in computers, that might be something that you forget.
Right.
So I really believe in the power of language and building systems around language to make people's lives better and to help them do things much more quickly. My good experiences with chatbots have all been, I've been in a very complex system. I need to do something. I don't know how to do it, but I can ask a conversational assistant. It'll figure out my sort of like natural language request in a way that like maybe me searching for a key term wouldn't in a given system. I am being intentionally vague because I can't talk about many details, but and I did the thing that I needed to do in like a minute instead of 30 minutes of searching or having to email somebody back and forth. And that was good.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it really depends on the use case. I think your point is that you're bringing up the very important point that the use case depends a lot on the user. So for me, there's times where I encounter conversational agents and I'm like, no, just show me the query interface for the database. Like if I'm trying to book a flight, which may again happen someday, there's a whole bunch of parameters. Like I want, here's my source and destination airports source. But how do we talk about
semantics?
Flights? Doesn't it? Departure?
That sounds right. Departure.
Yeah, okay. I don't know. Airplanes. It's a thing that used to exist and will exist again, and they exist, but it's not in my experience these days. But anyway, so there's the airport I'm flying from, the airport I'm flying to. There's the airlines that I like. There's the time of day that I want to go. There's, all these, that's how many places I'm willing to stop, how long am I willing, right? A whole bunch of parameters. I don't want to have a big, long back and forth with the computer when I know there's a screen where I can like tweak all those things. And that's, so that's the kind of thing where, but even with people, like way back in the before times when you got plane tickets by talking to a travel agent, the travel agent was sitting there with that kind of interface to the computer, and I had to use language to talk to them. Like, just turn your computer monitor around so I can look and see the thing. But there are other cases where it's not that structured, or I don't know how to access the structure. And so being able to ask a question, and especially if it's something that can do a multi-turn thing and get clarifications, can very much, spoiler again, take advantage of what we do with language. But I think it needs to be, again, really clear to the user what the limitations on the system are. And so, if I ask a question like, what's the number for an advice nurse? And it gives me a number that is specific to a particular, hospital system and health insurance, that the fact that I even needed to worry about that was off my radar in that moment. And so making that visible. And I think that what needs to be made apparent to a user probably also varies with the user and their experience of computers. And, somebody who's very computer literate and knows that they are dumb literal machines, is likely to be more skeptical of information and contextualize it in a different way than somebody who comes upon the computer and says, well, this thing is really high tech and futuristic and flashy, and so it must be telling me truth. And figuring out, doing real user studies and talking to people really representative of the population that's going to encounter your product, starting with the people who are most vulnerable, so that it's a system that works for them, I think is really, really, really important and hard to do because, when you're talking about who's in the room designing these things, we are not going to include people whose experience with computers is very limited. Just like by definition, right? The computer engineers don't have that property.
I wonder if there were any term that someone could search to learn more about this design approach.
Yes, I was talking about something that there's a body of scholarship. So value-sensitive design is where I'm speaking from, and that is the work of. So I think the leading figure there is Batya Friedman, but also several of her colleagues going back 25 or more years, and lots of really interesting ideas about how to identify stakeholders, so the people who are going to interact with the technology, but also people who are going to be affected by other people interacting with the technology, and then work with them to understand what that technology would mean for them and their value systems around it and how to support those values in the design of the technology. So I highly recommend value-sensitive design. There's really fun things too. So there's something called envisioning cards, which is this deck of cards. You were probably at a treehouse meeting where I broke them out.
That sounds right.
Yeah. And it's got a whole bunch of questions to, like, as you're designing your project, think, okay, well, what would happen if, this gets used by the majority of the population? Or what would happen if this is still in use 20 years from now? Or what would happen, consider the possible effects on the elderly, so it's just like very specific questions that help you think about these issues. And I think that's tremendously valuable because just having the prompt really, really helps. So you don't have to each time sit down and think, okay, who are all the people I need to be thinking of? Because people have thought that through.
Yeah, so good thing to look up if you're in this space. So we've been chatting for a bit, but before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to plug anything you have, something that you think would be useful for the Rasa community, people working in conversational AI or in NLP and industry generally.
What would be useful things to have?
Maybe your books.
Oh, yes, the books. Thank you. I'm like, I should recommend there's a book. Okay, so I have written, so singly authored the first one and then co-authored the second one, a pair of books basically presenting in bite-sized chunks useful things about how language works to help people who are working on language technology who have not had the chance to take a linguistics degree or even a linguistics class, sort of get a sense of how language works. First one, they're both called Linguistic Fundamentals for Natural Language Processing. The first one is on morphology and syntax, and the second one is on semantics and pragmatics, and they're available through Morgan Claypool as ebooks or physical books. And hopefully they are useful. They are definitely meant to be sort of small, digestible chunks. They're each designed around 100 things that's useful to know. And in fact, the title of the tutorial that was the predecessor of the first book was 100 Things You Always Wanted to Know About Linguistics But Were Afraid to Ask, subtitle For Fear of Being Told 1,000 More. But the series editor told me that I couldn't use that as the title of the book for two reasons. One is he thought nobody would get the cultural reference. I thought it was funny even without it. But also, he made the point that that first one was actually specifically looking at morphology and syntax. So how words are built up and how sentences are built up. And there's more to linguistics than that. And then the second one looks at semantics and pragmatics. So how do we get the meaning of a sentence out of the meaning of its parts? And then how do we get the impact or semantic import of a sentence based on how it's used? And that's still not everything. There should also be a book like this on phonetics and phonology. But I keep hoping I can find somebody to write because it's too far away from my area of expertise.
Don't give me that look.
Yeah, it'd be great. I'd be happy to advise you. And it occurs to me that there really ought to be one on language variation and other concepts from sociolinguistics. So certainly it's not everything about linguistics, but it's two relatively slim, sort of digestibly, I hope, volumes, just digestibly written volumes on linguistics that I encourage anyone who's curious to go check out.
And I obviously we're both linguists or have linguistic training. We care a lot about language. I don't think either of us would say you need a linguistics degree to build language products, but the more you know about language and the way that language works, and the more you sort of examine just the assumptions that you have as a language user, I think the easier it will be for you to build great language technology.
Yes, exactly. Because when we use language, we do it just so intuitively, we don't notice that we're using it. And it's what linguistics does is it basically shines a spotlight right on the language to see how it's working. And if you're trying to build something that works with language, looking at what's in that spotlight can be really helpful.
And also, you don't have to start from scratch, right? Linguists have been doing this for many thousand years. You can build on that. You do not have to, figure out brick making to build a house.
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah. And then if people want to, watch me rant on Twitter, they can find me at Emily M. Bender. I have a lot to say about linguistics in language technology and also the societal impact of NLP. And hopefully that is worthwhile to the world.
I always enjoy your Twitter thoughts. Thanks so much for joining me today, Emily. Thank you to all our listeners, and stay tuned for a shout out to our newest contributors.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in to Rasa Chats. As always, we want to end with a big shout out to all of our new Rasa contributors. So for code contributions, Liang W, thank you so much. And for support contributions, Yatharth Garg, Rai Pinjani, Debmalia Biswas, Elena Rikiradelli, and Nicholas Malamas. Thank you all very much for your support of the Rasa community. We're happy to have you. And if I said your name wrong again, please contact me, Rachael, and I will correct it on the next recording. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation that Emily and I had, and we'll see you in 2 weeks in the next one. Bye!